Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Monday, April 24th, 2023. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. Afghanistan Watchdog expects pilferage of Ukraine aid. So, the watchdog for U.S. spending on Afghanistan told Responsible Statecraft in an interview that he expects pilferage of U.S. aid to Ukraine. So, John Sopko, who has served as the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction since 2012, said that he personally favored creating a similar position for U.S. spending on the war in Ukraine. Explaining why more oversight on the Ukraine policy is needed, Sopko pointed to the fact that the U.S. has already authorized $113 billion in spending. He said, quote, that money is flowing like manna from the sky. If you don't get in there soon, you're going to see pilferage, end quote. Sopko said that he was not just concerned about the military assistance to Ukraine, but also aid dispersed by the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID. He said, quote, we've always had more problems with AID. In Afghanistan, my experience with them is that they have not been a very well-run organization, end quote. Sopko pointed to the fact that USAID was overseeing aid that's paying the salaries of the Ukrainian government workers. In Afghanistan, Sopko said that the Pentagon directed the paying of government salaries and that they could never come up with a system to make sure the U.S. was paying the salaries of real Afghans. He said, quote, well, have you heard anybody saying what's the system they have in place to ensure that they're not paying ghost Ukrainian civil servants, ghost Ukrainian police, ghost Ukrainian soldiers, end quote. Sopko said that USAID has had a poor track record on ghosts and on oversight, and he added that the State Department is even worse. So the U.S. has provided Ukraine with tens of billions of dollars in what they call this budgetary aid, which are funds that go directly to the Ukrainian government. So that's what he's talking about here. And it is money they just give to them, and then they're responsible for spending it. So there's no oversight there. I mean, they say USAID says that their inspector general is on it, but he goes on to explain why he doesn't think so. So Sopko said that he was worried about after the war when the U.S. and its allies fund Ukraine's reconstruction. He said, quote, the real crisis is going to happen once the shooting stops and they start laying concrete and they start rebuilding things. We're going to be buying horribly overpriced steel and cement and other products, end quote. U.S. government agencies have assigned their own inspector generals to oversee Ukraine aid, but have resisted efforts to establish a position similar to Sopko's. He said that a whole of government approach was necessary for this type of oversight. He said the Senate, actually, sorry, he didn't say this. This just happened. The Senate just voted down an amendment that was introduced by Senator Josh Hawley that would have created a special inspector general for Ukraine. It failed pretty badly. It was something like 28 votes to 60 something, with just Republicans voting in favor of it. So earlier this month, as I went over, Seymour Hersh had a report that made a huge allegation that the CIA is aware of rampant corruption in Ukraine. And according to Hersh's sources, according to a CIA assessment, they estimate that Ukrainian officials have skimmed at least $400 million in U.S. provided funds earmarked for diesel purchases. And, before Russia invaded Ukraine on February 24th, 2022, Ukraine's notorious corruption was commonly cited, commonly talked about by Western governments, Western media. Back in June 2021, President Biden said that Kiev must clean up corruption before it can join NATO, which is very rich coming from Biden because his son Hunter did land a job on the board of a Ukrainian natural gas company after the U.S. backed a coup in the country. But But since the U.S. began flooding Ukraine with weapons and money, we haven't heard much about that corruption. Zelensky had that little purge where he fired about 10 officials. According to Hersh's sources, there's the CIA gave him a list of 35 Ukrainian officials that they said were stealing money, basically. And Zelensky fired 10 of them. But, it was the first time we really heard from the Western media about the corruption in Ukraine, since the invasion and since the U.S. and its allies started spending all this money on this war. So, one good thing, if they appoint an inspector general like Sopko to do this, it would, I think, really shine a light on a lot of corruption, on a lot of waste. But it seems like they're really going to try to resist it. And I don't think, unfortunately, with Afghanistan, it didn't change anything. He was issuing these very scathing reports on U.S. policy in Afghanistan for a long time. But at least we know, it's something that we have evidence of, what a failed policy that was. All right, the next one here, this is from Kyle Anzalone. The U.S. is sending Abrams tanks to Germany to train Ukrainian soldiers. So America's top military officers said that the Pentagon will ship 31 Abrams tanks to Europe next month. Once in Germany, Ukrainian soldiers will train on the weapons platform until the tanks and troops are deployed to the battlefield. So Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, made the announcement while meeting with NATO partners in Germany. Milley said the tanks were not a silver bullet, but he believes when it's delivered and it reaches its operational capability, it will be very effective on the battlefield. The White House authorized sending Abrams tanks to Ukraine in January. Initially, the U.S. planned to purchase the new tanks for Kiev. However, last month, the Pentagon announced that it would accelerate the timetable by sending them older tanks. They're refurbishing older tanks and sending them. And apparently they're ready to go pretty soon, because even that plan was said to take up to 8 months, but it looks like they're going to get them over there and start training them on the tanks. And, right before they announced that they were going to send these tanks, you had Pentagon officials saying, no, it's not practical. It'll be too difficult for Ukraine to maintain, but then they ended up doing it anyway. And as Kyle explains, it was really just a way to get the German-made Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine. So NATO defense ministers, they met on Friday, and they also announced that they're going to create a hub to repair the Leopard tanks in Poland near the border with Ukraine. And member states pledged about $220 million in funding for the facility this year. So, it really shows the NATO involvement. They are creating this facility to repair their tanks right on the Ukrainian border. It's the tanks that they're giving them, they're training them on. Just all sorts of cooperation here. So Milley said that 200 to 300 Ukrainian troops will travel to Germany to train on the Abrams tanks in a 10-week course. He added that the U.S. had already trained 9,000 Ukrainian soldiers and was in the process of getting 2,500 more troops trained for the battlefield. So that's just, because the U.S. and NATO started training Ukraine's military after 2014, but those numbers he's talking about, that's just since the invasion, since the U.S. started specifically training them, outside of Ukraine for this war. They could also be training them inside Ukraine. We know there's special operations forces there, although we don't know what they're doing. All right, the next one here, this is another one from Kyle over at the Libertarian Institute. Ukraine asks NATO for a boost in military support to deliver victory. So Kiev's war goals have changed from survival to victory. And this is according to a top Ukrainian defense official. Ukraine's more ambitious goals come as its Western backers have continued to provide more advanced weapons and training for Ukrainian soldiers. So this comes from Oleksiy Reznikov, who is the Ukrainian defense minister. He told NBC News, quote, "There is a very palpable conviction among the participants that Ukraine should win, that it will be a joint success," end quote. So I'm not sure if that's a translation there, but he said that Ukraine should win, not that they will win, because we know from those leaks that the U.S. doesn't really have much confidence in Ukraine's capabilities here to push the Russians back. So this really story is just about how the rhetoric is changing, and this was during that same meeting when Milley announced the tanks and that facility that they met at the Ramstein Air Base in Germany, and they're saying we're with you all the way. So it's really just another sign. There's a lot of signs that this war is just not going to end anytime soon. All right, the next one here, Lavrov says that the U.S. denied visas for Russia UN journalists. So Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov on Sunday said that the U.S. denied visas to Russian journalists who wanted to cover his trip to New York for a UN Security Council meeting. So Lavrov said, he said this in Moscow before leaving for New York. He said, quote, "A country that calls itself the strongest, smartest, free, and fair country has chickened out and done something stupid by showing what its sworn assurances about protecting freedom of speech and access to information are really worth," end quote. So Lavrov hinted that Moscow would retaliate in some way, saying, quote, "Be sure that we will not forget and will not forgive," end quote. So the State Department did not respond directly to Lavrov's criticism, but claimed that the U.S., quote, "takes seriously its obligations as host country of the UN under the UN headquarters agreement, including with respect to visa issuance," end quote. So the Russian mission to the UN, they also issued a statement slamming the U.S. for denying visas for the journalists. So Russians are not happy about this. Apparently, it looked like there were some holdups with Lavrov's visa. I remember Russian officials were saying last week they weren't sure if he was going to get a visa to go attend this UN Security Council meeting that's going to be held on April 24th and 25th. And this meeting comes a few weeks after Russia detained an American reporter for the Wall Street Journal. So maybe this is some kind of retaliation for that. Lavrov and Blinken have, they spoke by the phone earlier this month about this journalist, Evan Gershkovich. But according to Moscow, this shows what kind of diplomat Tony Blinken is. They have no plans to meet. Lavrov's coming to the U.S., going to the UN, but Blinken has no plans to talk with him, on the sidelines of the UN Security Council or anything. Just not worth his time, I guess. I think that really shows how they're not interested in figuring out ways to end this war or reduce tensions. Just the way he operates, Blinken. I just want to take a moment now to mention we're starting our fundraiser this week. And it's that time of year again where we have to ask our readers and our listeners and viewers now for support. This is how we get by. We do these fundraisers, every quarter or 3 times a year, about that rate. And, we're entirely funded by our readers' donations. And that's just how we are able to do this and get by. So we have a letter here from Ted Galen Carpenter, who is now a senior fellow at the Randolph Bourne Institute, which is our parent company. He was with Cato, the Cato Institute, for 37 years, and they fired him, and they fired him because of his view on the Ukraine war. There was a letter sent to Cato about his writing, and they caved to the pressure. And, for those familiar with the Cato Institute, they've always had pretty solid foreign policy people. Like Ted, again, he's been there for 37 years. He writes for us. He's been a regular columnist for us for a while now, and he's going to be writing for us a lot more now. So Cato's loss is our gain, but we need your help, to pay him and to pay me and, the little salary that I make. This is how we do it. This is your donations go directly to us to basically keep the lights on and keep antiwar.com running. So you could go to antiwar.com/donate, and you could see the different ways that you could support us: a one-time donation, a monthly donation, special donations. So anything you can spare, whether it's $5, $10, if you could help us out, if we could try to get this fundraiser done quick so we could focus on our work, because this takes up a lot of effort, to get this money. So if you could help us out, we really appreciate it. Thanks. And I'm going to get back to the news here. So the next one, Brazil's Lula reaffirms Ukraine position after U.S. criticism. So Brazil's President Lula, he has reaffirmed his stance that countries should push for peace talks to resolve the war in Ukraine after coming under harsh criticism from the U.S. for his position. During a recent visit to China, Lula said the U.S. should stop encouraging the war in Ukraine and start talking about peace. And then the White House response was that he was parroting Russian and Chinese propaganda. So in Portugal on Saturday, Lula again called for peace talks. He's not backing down on this position. He said this at a press conference with Portugal's president. He said, quote, "We are not in favor of war. We want peace. Russia does not want to stop, and Ukraine does not want to stop. And if you don't talk about peace, you are contributing to war," end quote. And I think that's a pretty simple idea there, that like the U.S., you don't talk about peace. You just keep pouring weapons into the country. It's clear that you're contributing to war. So I don't think there's anything controversial about what he's saying. And Lula said that he understood the position of the European countries that want to keep arming Ukraine and said that he was trying to convey Brazil's position. He said, quote, Brazil does not want to participate in the war. Brazil wants to find a group of people who are willing to spend a little time talking with all the people who are willing to make peace, end quote. So the U.S., as I've covered a lot, and its European allies, most of its European allies, I should say, there are some exceptions, have discouraged peace talks throughout the war. Most recently, the U.S. came out against China's potential role as a mediator between the warring sides. Right before Xi Jinping went to Moscow, the White House said it opposed a ceasefire in Ukraine. I don't know how people are supposed to think anything other than that the U.S. doesn't want peace if those are the things they're saying. It's not Chinese or Russian propaganda. It's the truth. It's based on what you're saying. All right, the next one here. Ukraine requires public places to be de-Russified, and this is from Kyle again over at the Libertarian Institute. He put in a lot of work over the weekend. Zelensky has approved 2 new laws intended to erase Ukraine's Russian culture. The statutes will rename places in Ukraine which stem from the country's Russian influence. Additionally, local authorities will be mandated to free public space from the symbols of the Russian world. The laws will prohibit names that, quote, perpetuate, promote, or symbolize the occupying state or its notable, memorable, historical, and cultural places, cities, dates, events, and its figures who carried out military aggression against Ukraine, end quote. The new statute was signed on Friday and will take effect in 30 days. Local officials will then have 6 months to completely scrub public places of Russian culture. A board will be established to determine what names must be purged. So since 2014, Kiev has waged a culture war against Russian influence in Ukraine. After that coup that ousted Yanukovych, new language laws were imposed that sought to marginalize the Russian language. And Kyle points out an interesting fact here. Zelensky, who was a comedian at the time, had one of his movies, Love in the Big City 2, censored because it was in Russian. Roughly a fifth of Ukrainians identify as ethnic Russians, and more than that, speak as Russians. And I'm not sure what the demographics are now, especially since the war and the occupied areas and everything, but there's a lot of Russian speakers. And, this is one of the things that, Putin and the Russians wanted to stop in Ukraine, but, you launch a war, and it's become much more prevalent. And Zelensky has furthered the process called De-Russification. And, that's big thing is them going after that church, the Russian. It's not Russian Orthodox. It's Ukrainian Orthodox. It has historic ties to Moscow. All right. The next one here. Leaked docs show that Ukraine planned attacks on Russian forces in Syria. So this is another one from Kyle. Kiev's military intelligence agency believed that it could carry out attacks on Russian soldiers and Wagner Group forces in Syria, forcing Moscow to redeploy military assets from Ukraine. And this story was reported by the Washington Post using the documents that were released or allegedly released by Jack Teixeira. The Ukrainian defense officials believed that they could use Kurdish forces to wage a proxy war against Russia in Syria. According to the Post, the plan never materialized, as Zelensky ordered an end to the planning in December. So it appears that Ukrainian officials engaged in some discussions with the Syrian Democratic Forces, that's the SDF, the Kurdish militia that's backed by the U.S. in northeast Syria there, in eastern Syria. The documents said that the Kurdish officials requested training on drones and air defenses. Additionally, the Kurds said that they would not attack Russian positions in areas held by the SDF and requested their role in the operations be kept secret. Ukraine claimed, sorry about that. I'm stumbling on my words. Ukraine declined to respond to questions about the document. A Kurdish official claimed that the information was false. Russian forces have been in Syria, of course, since 2014. So I think the idea here was, attack the Russian forces there because there were reports that Russia pulled some troops out to send to Ukraine or to just build up in Western Russia and kind of distract them there. But it looks like that Zelensky ultimately called it off. And it's not clear if they could have actually pulled it up, pulled this thing off. All right. The next one here. China's foreign minister says that Beijing will never back down on Taiwan. So Chinese Foreign Minister Qin Gang said Friday that China will never back down on the issue of Taiwan, which Beijing views as its own territory, in a warning that was aimed at the US and the government in Taipei. So he made the comments toward the end of a speech on China's contributions to the global economy. He said, quote, "The Taiwan problem is at the core of China's core interests. We will never back down in the face of any act that undermines China's sovereignty and security. Those who play with fire on the question of Taiwan will burn themselves," end quote. China's military recently conducted 3 days of major live fire exercises around Taiwan in response to the President Tsai meeting with Kevin McCarthy. Beijing views these high-level contacts between U.S. and Taiwanese officials as a violation of the U.S.'s One China policy. China has stepped up the military pressure on Taiwan in recent years in direct response to the growing ties between Washington and Taipei. Despite the rise in tensions, China's warnings, the U.S. also is not backing down and continues to boost support for Taiwan in different ways. So Qin also responded to accusations that Beijing is looking to change the status quo across the Taiwan Strait. He said, quote, "It is not the Chinese mainland, but the Taiwan independent separatist forces and a handful of countries attempting to disrupt the status quo," end quote. And one thing, that the U.S. always says that they're committed to one China policy. They don't want to change the status quo. In recent years, they have significantly changed the way that they approach Taiwan. That's the reality from the U.S. side. And in response, China has really increased the pressure. And China's always said that they wouldn't rule out using military force. And the two things that could spark in it some sort of attack is Taiwan declaring independence, or just at some point the U.S. support will become intolerable, or they might be worried that eventually Taiwan will be too hard to conquer. I mean, they're already going to be very hard to take over because it's a big island and it would take a massive amphibious invasion. But all this stuff the U.S. is doing seems to be making something like that more likely. So since taking his post as China's foreign minister, Qin has explicitly warned that the U.S. and China are on a path toward war if things don't change. And that's something he said when he was the ambassador to the U.S., which was his old post before he became the foreign minister. All right, the next one here, the EU's Borrell tells Europe to send ships to the Taiwan Strait. So the EU's foreign policy chief, Joseph Borrell, has called on European countries to send warships through the Taiwan Strait, patrols that Beijing would view as provocations. So Borrell wrote in an op-ed for a French newspaper, quote, "Europe must in fact be very present on this issue of Taiwan, which concerns us economically, commercially, and technologically. That is why I call on European navies to patrol the Taiwan Strait to signify Europe's commitment to freedom of navigation in this absolutely crucial area. At the same time, we must be vigilant against provocations and overbidding," end quote. So Borrell's comments appear to be a rebuke to Macron, warning that Europe should not follow the U.S. into a conflict with China over Taiwan. What's interesting is that, despite Macron's comments, France is the only EU country that I'm aware of that actually sends warships through the Taiwan Strait. Taiwanese media reported that a French warship sailed through the strait on April 9th and 10th. And that was right after Macron made those comments. And now, one thing that kind of makes China more angry than the warships going through there is kind of publicizing it and saying, "Oh, we're sailing, this ship sailed through," like the U.S. Navy does. They put out these press releases. So I don't know if France's government actually did that or confirmed that, because this was from Taiwan's government confirmed it, but I don't think the French have. But the last known French transit through the Taiwan Strait before this one in April was October 2021. So it is rare. The U.S. does it much more frequently than European countries do. The U.K. did it last year or in 2021 as well, but they're not in the EU anymore. Germany, they deployed a naval vessel to the Asia Pacific for the first time in almost 2 decades, also in 2021. But they purposely did not go through the Taiwan Strait. So it's interesting to see Borrell kind of saying this in response to Macron when the French are the ones who are sending the warships there. All right. So the next one here. So this is a big story. This is from Connor Freeman, ex-CIA chief led campaign to smear Hunter Biden laptop story as Russian disinfo. So Mike Morrell, the former acting CIA director, revealed to the House Judiciary Committee, led by Representative Jim Jordan, that he played a key role in rallying former intelligence officials to sign a letter which sought to discredit reporting on the Hunter Biden scandal during the 2020 presidential campaign. So, in a transcribed interview with Jordan's team, Borrell explained that his role in the suppression of the key story was done on behalf of the Joe Biden campaign and at the behest of now Secretary of State Antony Blinken, who was then a senior campaign official. So, according to the committee's press release, quote, Morell testified that on or around October 17th, 2020, Blinken reached out to him to discuss the Hunter Biden laptop story. According to Morell, although Blinken's outreach was couched as simply gathering Morell's reaction to the Post story, it set in motion the events that led to the issuance of the public statement, end quote. The committee is now investigating Hunter Biden's laptop as well as the Biden family's international business dealings. So if you remember when this story came out in October 2020, published by the New York Post, it was censored by Twitter. And then these 50 former intelligence officials wrote this letter that was published by Politico calling it Russian disinformation when it was clearly not. It was Hunter Biden's laptop. And they just, blatantly lied about it. And, it's not a surprise to see Blinken tied to this. And this guy Morell says that they did it to help Biden's chances in the 2020 election. So it's a pretty big story. And I think it just shows how they're willing to just lie to people and just lie to us about Russia specifically. And Antony Blinken is very ready to lie about this issue. All right, the next one here. This is Special Forces, U.S. Special Forces evacuate U.S. Embassy staff from Sudan. So this is just a write-up about this from AP. U.S. Special Operations Forces carried out a precarious evacuation of the U.S. Embassy in Sudan on Sunday, sweeping in and out of the capital with helicopters on the ground for less than an hour. No shots were fired and no major casualties were reported. With the final embassy employee out of Khartoum, the United States shuttered its diplomatic mission indefinitely. Remaining behind in the East African nation are thousands of private American citizens. U.S. officials said it would be too dangerous to carry out a broader evacuation operation. So the battles seem to continue between these two generals, and it looks like the fighting is still going on. It's not clear really who's in charge of Sudan right now. But it looks like they went in and got out without incident there, the U.S. Troops. All right, the last one here, top House Democrat to visit Israel amid the Netanyahu's judicial overhaul unrest. So this is Hakeem Jeffries, who is now, again, the top leading Democrat, the House Minority Leader. So he's visiting Israel this week for the first time since replacing Nancy Pelosi as the leader of the House Democrats. Jeffries, who will be accompanied by 11 key Democrats, arrives in Israel after months of unprecedented criticism from fellow Democrats concerning Netanyahu's judicial overhaul. Among those traveling with Jeffries are Jewish representatives Debbie Wasserman Schultz, Sarah Jacobs, and Dean Phillips. Wasserman Schultz and Jacobs signed onto Rep. Jerry Nadler's letter to Israeli leadership expressing profound concern about the judicial overhaul's implications on Israeli democracy, while Phillips, the top-ranking Democrat on the House subcommittee focused on the Middle East, did not. So another participant on the trip is Representative Josh Gottheimer, widely viewed as the House Democrat most closely associated with AIPAC. He recently issued a statement urging U.S. lawmakers to avoid publicly commenting on Israel's internal affairs, although he later welcomed President Isaac Herzog's compromise plan. So Rep. Gregory Meeks, Jeffries' fellow New Yorker, he's also going to go. And the House Minority Leader and his accompanying delegation, all stalwart pro-Israel advocates, will attempt to cast an image of unyielding support amongst the Democratic Party for the U.S.-Israel relationship. Doesn't matter what Netanyahu's doing. They want to go there and show support. This is from Haaretz, this article, by the way, and their read on it is that it's highly unlikely that Jeffries or his colleagues will publicly castigate the plan or Netanyahu's far-right coalition. So they're going to go over there and say, we got your back, Netanyahu. But that is it for the news for today. That was a lot of stuff I packed in there. The viewpoints, we have some great ones as always. One from Tom Engelhart. War, what is it good for? Remarkably little. One from Ted Snyder, Lula goes to China, 3 takeaways. One from JD to Silly, Feds see the document leak as an opportunity for surveillance and control. That's over at Reason. One from William J. Astore, learning nothing from Iraq war. And then one from Branko Marchteach, why is Facebook censoring Hirsch's Nord Stream report? That's over at Responsible Statecraft. Yeah, apparently you can't post the Cy Hirsch Nord Stream report, the original one that he put out on Facebook. They're just outright censoring it, similar to what they did. Facebook didn't go as hard, as extreme as Twitter did with the Hunter Biden laptop story. Twitter, I think you couldn't even share the link. You couldn't even DM it to people. I don't think you can post it right now on Facebook, or it adds this notice that it's partly false information, but they don't know. They don't know anything over there. But that's it for me for today. Again, it's our fundraiser, so please go help us out. Help us get off to a good foot here. That's how you support this show, antiwar.com/donate. You could also support us by, telling people about antiwar.com, sharing it, sharing this show, subscribing on YouTube or Odyssey and Rumble, and liking it and commenting. Appreciate all that stuff. But anyway, that's it for me for today. I will be back tomorrow with a lot more news. Thanks for listening.